it doesn't really matter which image editor you choose, as long as you have some professional image editing software that you can use to make your elements for AutoPlay Media Studio and create, for example, elements for your buttons as well. So I'm just going to go ahead and create an empty document here in Photoshop, and I'll just show you one quick example of how I might use Photoshop in a project. So let's say we're planning out a project, and maybe we'll make this something very, very basic, like a simple business card. I would probably go into AutoPlay Media Studio and then decide upon my elements. Let's say we're going to put in some buttons, a screen, and a logo. And then I would just go ahead and create a layout for these elements in Photoshop and get them ready for AutoPlay Media Studio. Okay, so basically what I'm doing here is I'm just creating a tracer image, and I'm just basically laying out the elements so that I've got some type of basic visual representation of what it is I'm doing here. And you know, during the planning process, the one thing about this particular stage here is that it can save you a lot of time by sort of revealing any errors that you might have not anticipated right off the bat. So for example, if you are trying to add too many elements to your design, or not enough elements, or things like that, or elements that are going to be in conflict, it'll become apparent at this stage in the design. So you can go ahead and correct that before you actually go through to the next stage. So now I would go ahead and export this as a tracer image for my AutoPlay Media Studio file. So I'm going to go ahead and save it as a ping to my desktop. I'm just going to overwrite. I had one sitting there already. So I've saved it as tracer.ping to my desktop. And then I would actually go through here and bring that into AutoPlay Media Studio. So I've gone ahead and done that by clicking on here and going into my desktop and clicking on Tracer and pressing OK, and it's become part of my project. Alright, now in Adobe Photoshop I can go ahead, for example, now that I have my layout decided upon, and apply, for example, a style to one of these elements, and then just crop to that element so it's nice and quick. Export that element. So for example, this screen we'll call screen. I'll put it on my desktop, and then I'm actually just going to go ahead and drag that into my AutoPlay Media Studio file, and here I can just place it over my tracer image, and I know it's going to work out because I've already worked it out in advance. At any rate, you can go ahead and do that for each of the elements in AutoPlay Media Studio. For example, I could go back now and do my buttons. So let's say I would use this particular style, and then I could go through and paste that style to the other buttons, and it would be ready to go. I could export one of those buttons, bring it into AutoPlay Media Studio. So I'll just go ahead and do that. And then I can just lay it out according to my layout here. Select my buttons, distribute them, align them, and I'm ready to go. So in the end, I can of course go ahead in here to the page, get rid of my background image, and there we go. We're left with just the project. Now this is just a small example of how I might use Adobe Photoshop for my AutoPlay Media Studio projects. Of course, you can get very advanced. Adobe Photoshop is the most advanced image editor that there is, and you can do, you know, all sorts of stuff. But this is one simple example. At some point, hopefully, we will be putting out a CD specifically on Photoshop workflow. But for now, I just wanted you guys to be aware of this relationship between your image editor and your AutoPlay Media Studio files. You know, by creating that tracer image and then working with that, it can really open up a lot of possibilities to and increase the quality of your projects. Now, another element of Adobe Photoshop is the automation. So you can save, for example, styles. For example, here I had some styles that I applied that were already saved in my styles palette, but I could create ones from scratch and quickly save them, and it's quite easy to reuse those later. Now, this is important for your AutoPlay Media Studio projects because, for example, if you have one client who, let's say I'll go through to this screen layer here and I'll apply this golden style. Now, for example, let's say you have one client and you're using this golden style as their particular brand thing. Well, by storing it as a style, you've got this tiny little file that you can just load up and reuse for creating elements for them on an ongoing basis. For example, for the next 10 years you could use this style. So it's very good to leverage the automation and the customization features of Adobe Photoshop for your AutoPlay Media Studio projects. By storing, for example, styles or actions or scriptlets, you can go ahead and keep those with your AutoPlay Media Studio projects, and if you ever need them, they're there and they're handy, and you can just reuse them in the blink of an eye. Okay, so that's an overview of how I use Adobe Photoshop with AutoPlay Media Studio. Let's go on to the next video tutorial.